Hi, in today's video I wanted to share with you Apple's top 10 interview questions and how to answer them well. Question number 1, tell me about yourself. Okay, so your elevator pitch is by no surprise the most commonly asked interview question with Apple and even I dare to say with most high-performing companies today. Now, what is some advice when it comes to your elevator pitch that you have not heard previously? Well, actually, I have two pieces of advice here. The first one is that there's a huge trend in job interviews today, that of using AI to prepare your job interviews. There's nothing wrong with using AI to prepare your interviews, it's just that I was never able to correlate success of AI rewarded answers with people who passed interviews. So don't reward your answers using AI for the purpose of job interviews. Okay. The second piece of advice I'd like to give you would be to limit the amount of bluffing in tell me about yourself, because it could seriously backfire. At least in my experience, I have more than a few occasions where the interviewers use the elevator pitch as a starting point for a deep dive for the rest of the interview. And what happens is that if you oversell yourself, for example, you take ownership of more than you actually did in a project, then the deep dive will not be comfortable and will not flow to your advantage for the purpose of a job interview. Okay, so you'd probably want to decrease the amount of bluffing as soon as you progress throughout their interviews, right? So in a screening round, it might be perfectly fine to sell yourself, so to speak. But towards the end, when you're interviewing for the final interview rounds and right before that job offer, I found that people should decrease the amount of bluffing. Okay, and maybe one more quick thing here. You should also seriously consider following your interviewer's lead. What do I mean by this? Well, usually in a job interview, your interviewer will be the one introducing themselves or presenting you your information about the role, about your future team and whatnot. And this is quite valuable also to get a sense with respect to the length and depth in the information they provide, so you could follow that as well in your own answers. Because if they introduce themselves within 10 seconds, it makes very little sense for you to introduce yourself in 15 minutes, right? So this is what I mean, to follow their lead and maybe be a little bit more likable, see what their preferences are, and this is might as well score you points for your job interview. Second question I'd like to talk about here: how do you handle conflict inside your team? So questions around conflict are very common in job interviews, not just with Apple. And if you want a quick framework on how to answer these questions around interpersonal relationships, there are two types of conflicts: functional and non-functional. Functional conflict is around your subject matter expertise. So if you're an accountant, maybe you had some results in a report that a director disagreed with, and the way you'd resolve that conflict would be you look again at data, you prove your point with data, as well as listen carefully to the director's point of view with the goal to establish trust. Okay, the second type of conflict is the non-functional one. So, for example, if someone asks you, tell me about the time when someone did not like you. Okay, and these questions are asked are more specific to people manager level roles. Even though, if you get asked such a question in job interview for an individual contributor role, you could simply go on the functional side, present your functional conflict, like the example I just gave for the accountant role, right? There's no such thing you've never had a conflict in your career. There's no such thing if you work only remotely, it's impossible to have conflicts. There's no such thing of you are a very likable person and try to avoid conflicts, So conflict is a signal that you work in high-performing environments, and it's simple as that, right? Question number 3 here, tell me about the toughest decision or challenging project you've done in the past 6 months. Okay, so basically you are preparing for a deep dive here. Now, you could imagine the toughest decision or most challenging project would have highly different meanings for a PM when compared to an analyst or developer or solution architect or an AI scientist. However, still, in my experience, it's a good idea that you prepare something what I call the best story for the purpose of a job interview, because you'll be surprised how many people will struggle finding their best story or even picking their second or their third best story during the heat of the moment, you know. And chances are the toughest project or your best story will differ from interviewer to interviewer. You might want to share one thing with the recruiter when compared to someone who's highly technical for your job interview. So finding out what is the most interesting story you'd like to share with them is also something I found which as a particularly useful exercise. Also, this is a behavioral interview question. Tell me about the time when you had to make a challenging decision. Right, so this would mean that you would focus on answering this with the STAR format. Okay, situation, task, action, and result. This goes the same way with tell me about a conflict inside your team. Situation, task, action, and result. Right, but again, the reason why someone would ask you this, tell me about what's the toughest decision or most challenging project, is usually because they would start a deep dive. And deep dives are especially useful if you want to get to know someone, and especially if they did what they say they did within, you know, a short short time between, you know, the 45 minutes that an interview takes. Okay, question number 4, tell me about the time when you failed. Okay, this is the classic scenario of interview questions where they want to see if you took their interview seriously. Because if you did not take their interview seriously, chances are you'll get stuck with such interview questions. Right? Now, if you want to get your answers from good to great here, you know, it will take you 2 or 3 attempts to find the proper failure story. But if you really want to give great answers to these failure questions, you must find something with great learnings. Okay, so half of your answer should be learnings. Okay, simple as that. Again, a behavioral interview question, the result part of your STAR answer is half with the learnings. Question number 5, tell me about the time when a product, service, or solution was already receiving good customer feedback, but you decided to do more. Okay, again, a behavioral interview question and a trick question. Now, from my experience, like 75% of candidates will give an example of a product, service, or solution that was, you know, a bit buggy, a bit inappropriate, which they fixed so their customer was happy. Now, the problem with such examples is that your baseline scenario is low. The qualitative threshold for you is very low. And the core reason why someone would ask you this in a job interview would see how high your standards are. Right? Because if you'd compare to an example of a project or service that you fixed for a customer with the example of a service that was working extraordinarily well, and you looked around the corner to find an extra report to delight your customer, if you'd make a difference between these two candidates, you will immediately spot the difference in their standards. What one calls a quality, the baseline scenario for quality versus the other. Okay, so long story short, exhibit high standards in job interviews, exhibit high standards in the type of work that you do. High standards means different things in different roles. You know, an accountant with high standards will communicate extremely differently when compared to a developer with high standards, right? So that's why I cannot really be too specific here, but you should expect these trick questions. Question number 6, how do you show customer obsession? Okay, so now this interview question does not only apply to customer-facing roles, it applies to pretty much any role, and it's a huge part of interviewing processes in most businesses with a digital presence, right? So it's true, you know, Apple also has a physical presence, right? But furthermore, whenever you run a digital business, you are interested in working, in hiring people that are customer obsessed versus with customer support skills. And as with the previous interview question I shared, a time when a product service was already receiving good customer feedback, but you decided to do more. This is also a question designed to differentiate between candidates on standards of work. Okay, most people are not customer obsessed. This is what you should keep in mind. And also the way the question is framed, how do you show customer obsession? It's an open-ended question. Still, I would even translate this to you. Tell me about the time when you exhibited customer obsession, right? And even if you can even consider this question the same as the previous one for many, many roles, especially in IT. Okay, but long story short, customer obsession is something you should define who your customer is. Maybe it's an internal one for many of you, and be prepared to answer questions around this topic as well. Question number 7, why Apple? Okay, so why Apple is, I would say unsurprisingly, a very commonly asked question in a job interview. Maybe even on the second or third spot as the most commonly asked question, but I wanted to diversify a little bit the discussion here. Now, when it comes to why Apple, what you should understand that vast majority of candidates would over-compliment these companies. And rightfully so, they're an amazing business and whatnot, but your job is to get hired there. And the way you get hired is not by over-complimenting them most of the time, but by saying something that would differentiate yourself in a good way, of course, from other candidates, right? So if you want to go on extremes, and if your CV allows it, you could even go with something on the lines of, you know what, I'm not even sure I want to join you as of yet. I'm here to learn about the opportunity and to see if the type of experience I have could be mutually beneficial for this role. Okay, so if your CV allows, yes, there are people who do this in job interviews with high-performing companies, just that, it's a matter of choice. But my advice to you would be to try to differentiate yourself from other candidates however you can, simply because if you put yourself in your interviewer's shoes and you hear people complimenting Apple over and over again, you can imagine that when you hear a different answer from a candidate, that will play a positive role in you evaluating that candidate's potential and performance for the purpose of that job interview. Okay. Question number 8. Tell me about the time when you laid out a vision when there wasn't one. Okay, so maybe not every roles are required to be visionaries at Apple, but if laying out a vision and being a visionary does make sense in your role, and it does make sense to many, many roles, especially in leadership, then this is something I would definitely take quite seriously. Okay, so again, a behavioral interview question. You would want to present a situation with a challenge. What was the challenge? Then the action would be your vision, and with some results. What was the result of your vision? Obviously a positive one, but maybe quantify it with some metrics if you can. So you give convincing answers. Now you can imagine a vision is different for a manager when compared to a developer or an analyst or a solutions architect. Right. Question number 9. What is your 30, 60, 90 day plan if you get a job? Okay, so this is a trending interview question. What would you do within the first XYZ days of getting the job? And I found that the best way you go around answering these interview questions would also try to link it to a past experience, behaviorally, so to speak, because most of you would have already been in a new role already, so you will think what would be the levels of success in your new role. If you haven't been in a new role already, then it's quite simple. You will have to learn as much as possible about the business. But most of the time, linking this with your previous experiences and setting up a plan will provide some of the best possible answers. That's why I would advise you to prepare in advance if you can. Okay, and question number 10, last but not least, what's your favorite Apple product or service? Okay, so they do ask this question. They are asking these questions for a number of years now. So what would be the Apple's product or service that excites you the most. For me, it's their watch. And you know, if you could blend this with the type of role you're applying for, I believe that would even exhibit your commercialism a bit better and would help to sell yourself as an even better candidate. So I hope you found this list useful, and thank you very much for watching.